Development Subcommittee will now come to order. Good afternoon, everyone. As this hearing is fully virtual, I'm going to address a few housekeeping matters as well. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they're not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members, however, are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice when you're recognized that you are unmuted, or that you're muted, I'll ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept the request so that you're no longer muted. I remind all members and the witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and then of course you can claim the remaining time. You will notice a clock on the screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn a bright yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red, and you can finish your sentence, finish your thought, but we will then turn to the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we'll begin with the chair and ranking member. Then members will be recognized in order of seniority, alternating sides. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we've set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, with housekeeping administrative items out of the way, let's turn to our witness, to our main business of the afternoon. Welcome, Secretary Buttigieg. Your second appearance before the THUD subcommittee, of course, in a bit virtual format, but still a good turnout of members. I think almost 100%, and a chance to have a productive conversation. Welcome to the members of the subcommittee. Glad to see all of you. I appreciate your participation today, and remind you, of course, to mute your mics so when you're not speaking, and to ensure that you keep your video on so we can see your face and so you can be recognized. Mr. Secretary, we've had the pleasure of working together over the last 15 months on our shared vision for transforming America's transportation infrastructure into safer, more accessible, more equitable networks. Through the enactment of the monumental Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts, the IIJA, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and equally important, the fiscal year 2022 Transportation and Housing Appropriations Bill. I want to thank you for your leadership, both publicly and behind the scenes, as we've advanced these shared goals and have made historic investment in our transportation networks. When you combine all this, Congress has enacted $143 billion in new funding for highways, bridges, airports, ports, rail, public transit systems for the current fiscal year. I look forward to continuing our work together to move these investments forward, get them on the street, officially begin our work today then on the fiscal 2023 budget. It's a good budget. It includes $105 billion for the nation's transportation systems, funding that is necessary to continue to address our distressed infrastructure, all of it, roads, bridges, airports, ports, rail, and public transit systems. The president's request will be leveraged by the $36.8 billion provided by the IIJA in advanced appropriations to modernize and improve transportation networks across the country, increase safety, reduce emissions, and contribute to the mitigation of climate change and addressing equity, those goals that we hold before us in all that we do. While the IIJA provides greater funding opportunities for states, local governments, and transportation agencies, Congress must continue to provide robust annual funding, annual federal funding, to enable all these stakeholders to see the projects through and to address our needs systematically year after year after year. That is what this subcommittee does. And those needs have accumulated, as we all know. The American Society of Civil Engineers graded America's infrastructure overall as a C- in its most recent 2021 report card, with aviation, roads, and transit scoring down in the D range. They also estimated last year the total needed to fix our infrastructure, 2.59 trillion over 10 years, a stunning figure, just to bring our infrastructure into good condition. So we've made a significant start. The IIJ will certainly propel us toward the needed transformation, but the president's budget request and much more are going to be required to close these funding gaps. We have a big job to do. The president's budget allows for new or improved service across all modes, and we're happy to say that it's building on this subcommittee's commitment to examine and address our transportation needs, including some of the adverse effects of past policies. You know, there have been in the past, under the guise of urban renewal, for example, there's been disparate impacts through the way we did highways, we did throughways, cutting through urban neighborhoods. So all of us know that there's some correctives that need to be applied, and in some cases, some possible compensatory policies to address some of these inequities and to move forward in a more positive way. Mr. Diaz-Balart and I, and members on both sides of the aisle, have worked on this subcommittee for years to augment authorized and formula amounts to also all sorts of transportation, all modes of transportation. And I must say, we've sometimes immodestly noted that while everybody's been talking infrastructure and declaring infrastructure week and that sort of thing, this committee actually has been funding it, and funding it in a serious way for years. All modes have benefited, but our focus on intercity passenger rail and transit has been particularly noteworthy. And the 2023 budget request picks up on that, makes great strides toward reducing single occupancy vehicle trips, traffic congestion, and harmful emissions by proposing that $3 billion be invested in Amtrak, another $1.3 billion in 3 competitive grant programs that can support passenger rail. That would be $500 million for the oversubscribed CRISI program, $2.85 billion for the capital investment grants programs, new starts for transit, and $150 million for new competitive grants to improve the resilience of transit assets and help transit agencies transition their fleets to zero emission buses. All of these represent increases above fiscal 22. The area I represent in North Carolina offers a good example of what investments can mean. Now, I don't aspire to be Mr. S-Line. I don't think I can match Amtrak Joe. But I must say that getting this S-Line corridor from Raleigh to Richmond developed will be an enormous step, the key step in completing development of the Southeast Passenger Rail Corridor. The states of North Carolina and Virginia, with generous help from CRISI, are well on their way to getting this done. And the resources in this budget and in the IIJA will let us get it done here and get it done elsewhere. It'll replicate this success in corridors ideally suited to passenger rail travel across the country. I also want to note that the budget request makes critical investments in technical assistance and capacity building in underserved communities to promote equitable access to the resources we've approved. Part of this is the new Thriving Communities Initiative, which I'm sure the Secretary will address. This too builds on the bipartisan work that this committee has done over several years to support communities of persistent poverty. Overall, the 2023 budget request dedicates $26.8 billion in discretionary resources to take care of our most immediate needs, including the necessary resources to keep DOT staffed and prepared to implement and oversee these critical investments. So, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Diaz-Balart and I look forward to working with you in crafting a bipartisan bill that helps address the unmet infrastructure needs of this country. Mr. Secretary, we look forward to your testimony today, to working with you to ensure that DOT has the funding it needs to carry out its critical mission. Now let me turn to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope my voice holds up. Mr. Secretary, great to have you once again in front of the subcommittee. And to you, Mr. Price, it's an honor, Chairman, to embark on your final season of hearings. I look forward to working with you to complete the 2023 THUD bill on time. I know that we're going to get started on the details of this bill as soon as all the hearings are over, and we have quite a few hearings still left to go. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, our staffs are already burning the midnight oil, preparing for what is going to be an extremely busy number of weeks ahead. Mr. Chairman, I want to make sure that this bill is a capstone of your career, and I pledge to you that I will do anything that I can and everything that I can to get this bill finished across the line in the next coming months. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to discussing the $27 billion discretionary request for the Department of Transportation today. I would note that your discretionary request is really just a small part, one part of the resources that we have entrusted to your department. Altogether, your request for FY23 is $142 billion. That's including $37 billion in advance appropriations through the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. Now, I consider these advance appropriations to be fully under the jurisdiction of this committee. These funds will not be on autopilot. They instead will be subject to vigorous oversight by this committee. I want to make sure that every dollar has a return on the investment for the taxpayer, and that we never let either the bureaucracy or political agendas get in the way of delivering results for the people of this great country. Our work this year should be guided by a commitment to face the serious challenges, both new and old. And I will tell you, whether those challenges are excess government regulation, those challenges are now also inflation that is eroding the quality of life of families across the country and really hurting people in our country. The supply chain disruptions that continue, and really an over-reliance on manufactured goods from adversaries, particular communist China. So these issues are obviously not all of them are fully in the hands of the DOT, obviously, but the department's decisions, the policies, and the spending priorities need to contribute to solutions to these challenges and clearly not make those challenges any worse. And finally, excuse me, we cannot ignore the impact of excessive spending and the rising debt on families today. With inflation and rising interest rates seriously eroding the quality of life of all Americans. The president's budget request for all non-defense discretionary spending is 14% above last year. That's for non-defense discretionary. Frankly, it looks a lot like last year's request. It is both excessive and out of balance, with defense getting, again, an increase that doesn't even keep up with inflation. But this committee will work towards a bipartisan top-line agreement for fiscal year 23. And then the chairman and I will be able to work together along with the members of this subcommittee to finalize an on-time, hopefully, fiscally responsible budget for DOT. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate your willingness to serve and your willingness to always be available. I look forward to your testimony and again to our continuing dialogue as this process moves forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mario. And now, Mr. Secretary, we're happy to turn to you. We are grateful that you're here, and we look forward to your highlighting of the 2023 budget request. I'm going to recognize you for 5 minutes to summarize your statement. Of course, your full testimony will be entered in the hearing record. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart, and to all members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the President's fiscal year 2023 budget request for the Department of Transportation. I first want to thank members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who delivered the bipartisan infrastructure law as well as the fiscal year 2022 omnibus. Because of these historic investments, the department is now in a much stronger position to help build the transportation future that the American people need and deserve. One that's safer, more efficient, and more affordable for everyone, from families transporting kids to businesses moving goods. And we have acted urgently and responsibly to start delivering that. We recently saw the dramatic collapse of a bridge in Pittsburgh. the emergency closure of the major I-40 Hernando de Soto bridge that connects Tennessee and Arkansas, and the closure or weight limiting of so many bridges affecting communities across the country. In December, we were able to allocate the largest federal highway funding to states in decades, $52.5 billion, to make roads and bridges safer and more resilient, more modern, so people can get to where they need to go. Another urgent priority for us is addressing the pandemic-driven supply chain disruptions and the accompanying inflation, while acting to ensure our supply chains are resilient into the future. The steps we're taking include efforts to support truck drivers, supplement inland ports, and modernize our port infrastructure, all help to move record volumes of goods more quickly and stem the rising costs of shipping. And it's showing results. The number of container ships total waiting for berths at U.S. ports has dropped by 35% since peaking in early February. Employment for trucking rose in 2021 to its highest level since 1990. And grocery and drug stores have products in stock at almost the exact level as before the pandemic. We will continue to address issues wherever they arise, whether that's longer dwell times on U.S. freight rail or the COVID-driven stops and starts in China, which we are monitoring closely. Across our transportation systems, there is still much more to do to achieve our goals, from lowering costs to giving people back time in their day. In fiscal year 2023, we are now poised to build on early progress with the President's budget for the Department of Transportation that totals $142 billion, including $36.8 billion in advance appropriations provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law in that year. Allow me to give you a few highlights. Safety remains our top priority, and the budget includes funding to help address the crisis of deaths on America's roadways, as outlined in our National Roadway Safety Strategy. That includes $3 billion in the Highway Safety Improvement Program. With $4 billion for RAISE and the new MEGA program, we will rebuild century-old infrastructure and lay the groundwork for America to compete and win in the decades ahead. With $23.6 billion for the Federal Aviation Administration, we'll further enhance aviation safety, combat the effects of aviation on the climate, and improve airport infrastructure. With $4.45 billion in capital investment grants, we will advance 15 major transit projects that shorten commutes, increase access to jobs, and reduce congestion on the road for millions of Americans. We'll invest $17.9 billion to reverse decades of underinvestment in intercity passenger rail and make fast, reliable train service available to more people. We'll provide $1 billion to build out a nationwide network of electric vehicle chargers so that Americans in every part of the country have access to the lower monthly costs of electric vehicles. We'll also begin implementing our ambitious new fuel efficiency standards, which are projected to save the typical household hundreds of dollars in gas costs and prevent 2.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide from reaching our atmosphere. And to keep making progress on supply chains to help move goods faster and fight inflation, we will invest a total of $680 million to modernize ports, $3 billion to improve the roadways that carry the majority of America's freight, and a total of $1.5 billion for CRISI grants to improve freight rail. That's just a sample of the improvements the American people will experience when they drive, fly, ride, and shop, as enhancing our transportation systems directly helps lower the transportation costs of goods and services. We understand that the tremendous opportunity we've been given to help modernize our country's infrastructure comes with a profound responsibility to use taxpayer dollars efficiently and wisely, and to make resources more accessible to state and local governments so they can build good projects. This type of infrastructure transformation only happens at most once every generation, and it only happens if we work together. So I want to again thank you for demonstrating that democracies can deliver a better future for the people they represent, and for your work to ensure that the United States remains the global economic leader. I look forward to addressing your questions, and thank you again for the chance to be with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Well, let me open the questions with one that picks up on your statement in terms of the multiple funding streams that we've devoted to transportation and infrastructure over these last couple of years, and your responsibility for making sure all this works together and gets where it's supposed to go and underwrites the kind of economic growth and prosperity that we all are aiming for. You have in 3 fiscal years, the department has been provided with something like $106 billion in COVID relief, More recently, the IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, put something like 661 billion into roads, bridges, airports, ports, transit, and rail systems over a 5-year period. There have been, and that includes, of course, the advanced appropriations. This is on top of the annual appropriations, and we have gone above authorized levels in those bills, like $19 billion above authorized levels that this subcommittee has taken the lead in providing over recent years. So we're responding here, of course, to a great need, but there is a challenge to coordinate this and to do it with due diligence, to do it responsibly and well. So how's it going? That's my question, basically. What kind of challenges of coordination and control does this pose for the department, and how are you dealing with them? What kind of workforce needs does it pose? You know, there was special IIJA hiring authority that OPM provided back in February. Have you made use of that? How are you dealing with the workplace needs? You're dealing, of course, in a competitive job market to hire the people you need. And then most importantly, how is it going with respect to getting the money where it's supposed to go, getting the money to the designated recipients in the case of formula enhancements, and also getting the grant programs and grant processes going in terms of competitive programs. We're aware, of course, of the special White House effort headed by Mr. Landrieu. How do you work with that? How is this going to come together so that we, of course, exercise due diligence over the use of these funds, but at the same time make sure these funds have the maximum impact in a limited period of time?
Thank you very much, Chairman, for the question. And it's really the question that we are working with every day here in this department. When Congress makes these resources available, that creates the challenge and the opportunity for us to make good use of them, trying to do so as promptly as possible, but also do so responsibly and get it right. In some cases, this is an expansion of programs that exist that are very familiar to communities and to this department. In other cases, in many cases, it involves creating whole new programs and ensuring that the guidance is correctly framed up for those and that they get off to a good start. I'm pleased to say that we've made significant progress on getting funding to states, cities, and communities for many major programs provided for by the law. We at the department have established an executive policy council responsible for overseeing the department's implementation and making sure that the results are on time, on task, and on budget for the American people. And this is also happening within the wider context of the administration-wide infrastructure implementation task force and the work of Mitch Landrieu as senior advisor and infrastructure implementation coordinator. So we're often at the interagency table with the other departments working other parts of the bill. We've opened applications for discretionary grant funding. We've set out apportionments for formula funding and moved over $79 billion out to be made available. And throughout the summer and fall, we'll be announcing additional funding opportunities for bridges, transit, rail ports, airports, and other projects. You mentioned workforce, which is certainly going to be an opportunity and a challenge for the entire construction transportation sector, and certainly for our department too. Some of the occupations that we are working right now to hire in include engineers, program analysts, transportation specialists, motor carrier safety specialists, transportation industry analysts, environmental protection specialists, grants management specialists, community planners, and others. Because, of course, we need to make sure that we have the skills and the talent in this building to responsibly deliver that funding. That hiring is underway. We've certainly got many more positions to fill, and we're at work on a daily basis to do so.
Okay, thank you. I know, like many members, I've been having sessions with stakeholders, state, local stakeholders who are eager to know how and when and where to apply. And I must say, the website that you've set up is one of the best I've seen for giving very precise information about where to turn and what the timetable is for putting these programs in force and so on. It's unusually good, and of course a huge help to members like all of us on this subcommittee who want to see our state and local stakeholders taking full advantage of this and making effective applications. Okay, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, the IIJA establishes one federal decision mandate to streamline environmental reviews for obviously large infrastructure projects. Now, I would note that this is an effort initiated by the previous administration and then canceled by the Biden administration in a spree of canceling common sense executive orders. Fortunately, this initiative was codified into law in the infrastructure bill through a bipartisan effort. So, Mr. Secretary, as you, I'm sure, agree, too often regulatory delays drive up the cost or even leave communities waiting for sometimes years for projects to get completed. And we all know that the US leads the world in scientific and engineering talent. So it's clear that this is a bureaucratic issue, not a technical know-how issue. So here's a question, Mr. Secretary. Can you provide us with the status of your implementation of the one federal decision and the kinds of real measurable results that we should expect to see in the coming months and the coming years? Specifically, for example, as you implement this law, will you be able to measure the following three areas: the reduced time for permit approvals, the dollars saved, and thirdly, the jobs created? So I would ask that you be as specific as possible, and also that you keep our committee updated on your efforts to implement the one federal decision.
Thank you, and I certainly welcome the opportunity to remain in touch with your offices individually and as a committee on this. As you know, has a lot of process improvement provisions aimed at improving environmental review and permitting to advance transportation infrastructure and recognize the benefits of these investments as promptly as possible while still meeting the requirements that are expected of them. A couple of things I would note. One is that there was a very aggressive timeline toward the first requirement, chronologically first requirement, which is a 60-day requirement on the development of categorical exclusions. We met that timeline, consulting with the federal agencies that were specified, identifying categorical exclusions in federal highway, and providing the substantiating information that could help accelerate the delivery of projects if available there. We're also taking other steps to improve by making greater use of the federal permitting dashboard, which right now tracks over 240 active transportation projects. The Infrastructure Permitting Improvement Center, which manages that dashboard, is a body that we're working with to help expedite project delivery, and I think provide detail of the type that you're talking about, at least in part, to try to make sure there's visibility on what's happening in terms of timeliness, in terms of compliance, and we'll continue working to post information on things like the categorical exclusions to provide some transparencies there. We will continue also with public involvement guidelines to try to document public engagement, make sure that it's far-reaching, equitable, and of course, the more smoothly that goes up front, the fewer issues will be encountered later down the line. And welcome further opportunities, whether it's in the provisions that are called out for by the law, or within those boundaries that have been set out to make sure that, again, of course, while meeting and respecting all requirements, we're being as efficient and as smooth as we can in delivery.
And Mr. Secretary, again, I look forward to you keeping us in the loop as much as possible as to how you're doing, how you're progressing, and what are those specific savings in time or the other two categories that I mentioned. So I'm assuming we can count on you doing that, right?
We'd certainly welcome the chance to continue providing as much good information as we have on this.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Mike, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, some of the civics lessons we have aren't as helpful as others. I wanted to talk about the 5G spectrum rollout. Obviously, I think calls for the need for greater coordination, sometimes between federal agencies. Now, some of this is new stuff, and we learn as we go, but the public discussion, I guess we'd call it, between FAA and FCC wasn't particularly helpful. It was probably avoidable and not particularly productive. The resolution to 5G for airports and air carriers is going to take some time to resolve, and FAA has some temporary stopgap measures in place. But obviously, how are we working with the White House and FCC to resolve these 5G spectrum issues, and how do we avoid this in the future? Because obviously 5G is going to take a while as it begins to be incorporated, but the lessons for 6G and beyond as well.
Thank you, Congressman. As you noted, the most important thing is going to be coordination. The last minute and urgent issues that arose at the beginning of this year were years in the making. And what we've seen in places that have been able to have the safe and efficient coexistence of 5G cell technology and aviation operations is a strong level of communication and coordination between telecommunications and aviation regulators well in advance of any kind of deployment. I will say that we've made significant progress since January, with the FAA, of course, principally focused on its core mission of safety, but with the dialogue with telecommunications industry as well as regulators on how to ensure that that's compatible with the 5G rollout. That communication and interaction has allowed us to refine the risk model around runways. It's allowed wireless companies to turn on the majority of their transmitters, activating about 90% of their installed network of transmitters, but recognizing that there remain more transmitters that are economically very important for them to be able to activate, where that needs to be deconflicted with the safety imperatives on the aviation side. So the long-term solution is to establish a new performance standard for altimeters in the presence of that C-band spectrum. In the meantime, based on what I would say is an entirely voluntary arrangement that reflects, I think, great credit on the willingness of telecom operators, aircraft equipment manufacturers, airlines, and different federal agencies to cooperate. We've been able to work to ensure that modifications like filters and other things that can be applied to the aircraft are done as quickly as possible while also refining the model. There will be more instances, as you mentioned, whether we're talking about 5G or other spectrum issues as we go. And so we are undertaking efforts to communicate more closely than I think has ever been done in the past with relevant players, to include NTIA and Commerce, the FCC, the White House, in some circumstances DOD, and anybody else on the federal side with involvement here, as well as ensuring continued healthy dialogue on the industry side.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that there's also communications with those in the technology side of this as the industry expands and moves at literally the speed of light towards 5G isn't done. I mean, there's a lot more that's going to be incorporated, but this is a worldwide issue. So we want U.S. travelers to feel safe wherever they're going, and I think there is some lack of information and concern about how this is playing out in other countries at the same time.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that we are prepared and aware of forthcoming technologies, because again, the spectrum is only going to become more important from a transportation perspective and industry perspective. We need to be able to identify any of these issues well in advance of anything like the events of January.
Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. Good to see you again, and it's always good to see a mayor, by golly. Someone who's had the experience of creating and executing an actual budget and probably on time, and making government work. So I'm deeply appreciative, and I'm sure that you probably are a little bit anxious about the Congress and its inability to do what mayors all around the country have been able to do year after year after year, and that's do the basic functions of government. It's my understanding from my staff that you and your team and my staff have been working on an exemption request from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for an Arkansas company. I want to thank you and your staff for your attention to the matter. Hope that we can continue to work through the company's request in an expeditious manner, and I'm sure we will. My colleague, Mr. Quigley, was talking about 5G, and I'm going to also talk about it. But at the same time, I want to congratulate you, give you some of the credit for it, because when you took the reins on this 5G rollout in January and brokered a voluntary agreement between parties, it was obvious to me that there was a lack of leadership on the issue. And I understand the aviation concerns caused by the rollout, but also understand why the wireless carriers are eager to roll out transformative service. But again, it takes leadership to get this done, and then I want to commend you for that. So, a quick question about it. You mentioned the NTIA. That's between the FCC and the NTIA, and this whole issue of spectrum coordination. Do you feel like there's an appropriate level of coordination? And that's question one. Number two would be, are you resourced appropriately to be able to handle this coordination?
Well, thank you for the question. I believe that there is now going forward, though there was not always previously. Pleased to see the arrival of the confirmed leadership for NTIA, and again a level of dialogue that was forced by this issue between FAA, FCC, and other parties, both on the public sector and industry side. We'll make sure to alert Congress if we feel that further resources are needed to support this work, because transportation is increasingly a matter of communications technology. There's a lot of overlap there, and I don't mean to suggest that the jurisdictional lines aren't clear, but the communication across them to make sure that we head off these kinds of issues does need to be stronger, and I think will be as a result of the lessons learned from this experience.
Thank you. I'll note for the committee that this issue certainly is not going to go away, but I believe that the parties are working towards solutions for the short term. But 5G spectrum use is only going to increase. So last question for me on this subject is related to this committee's work. Does FAA have, and you've kind of addressed some of the resource needs right now, but as we look to the budget that has been presented in the work for FY23, are you satisfied with the resources in that budget? And the second part of the question is more about brain drain. Are we suffering? I would assume so, from what's going on at the FAA, given its many duties and projects. And are you having to pull people off of other projects to be able to work toward it? So, and that'll be the end of my first line of questions.
Well, thank you. Yes, very briefly, it took enormous work on the part of the safety organization, including working in areas that they typically hadn't. Teaming up with telecom experts to model interference is an example of something that's just different from what a lot of people in the safety organization had been asked to do. The budget request for fiscal 23 does support that safety organization, those engineers, and that technical expertise. We do find ourselves, like I think so many in the private and public sector, in a moment of working to hire and build that organization further. And that's a challenge and an opportunity for us right now.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back, Mr. Secretary. We're delighted to have you here. I want to thank you for your work and your leadership in getting the infrastructure law passed. And we know the work ahead of us, and we are looking forward to partnering with you on it. One of the things that we know for sure is that almost 30% of our total greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. And the primary source of that is fossil fuel burning cars and trucks. And the bipartisan infrastructure law addressed this significant source of carbon dioxide emissions by making historic investments in electric vehicle infrastructure. Your budget invests $1 billion in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program and $400 million in charging and fueling grant programs. Can you tell us how these investments are going to impact the lives of everyday Americans who may be considering transitioning to an electric vehicle?
Yes, and thank you for the question. This is absolutely essential to get right in order for us to meet our broader climate goals. And what we know is that there is existing technology today in terms of electric vehicles that if we can make sure that more Americans can conveniently and affordably access it, it will mean dramatically fewer emissions and, importantly, savings for those families, those drivers as well, in reduced fuel costs and maintenance costs. The Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program is providing this year $1 billion to states to provide funding for their plans to help build out a national highway network. I would also emphasize that I should say a charging network across the national highway system. I would emphasize that we're in a great model of partnership right now with the Department of Energy because under the infrastructure law, we're able to set up a joint office with them to help make sure that we manage this program well. It's accompanied with a discretionary program that will represent $400 million in fiscal 23 to help fill in some of the gaps and help communities with their charging needs. We also are mindful of the need to make sure that there is a greater level of public understanding about the benefits of electric vehicles, and that we do our part to try to help make them affordable, which other proposals with Congress could help to do. But right now, there are fuel savings to be captured by families who may simply be hesitating because of range anxiety, the fear that you might not have a charger between where you start and where you're headed. And that's exactly what we can address with this formula program. So the plans are due back in from the states by August, and then pending approval of those plans, we'll be able to get the funding moving promptly after that and start seeing these chargers go into the ground.
That will be great news. And I also wondered, related to this, there is an electric vehicle working group. Can you tell us when the members of this working group are going to be selected, how people can volunteer, and how you're going to ensure diversity in this group?
Yes, in fact, teaming up right now with the Department of Energy, we're establishing this electric vehicle working group whose functions will be to make recommendations on the development and the adoption, as well as the integration of light, medium, and heavy-duty EVs into our transportation and energy systems. We will soon be actively soliciting input on the composition and design of this committee, and we'll have more information on the process for selecting members in the weeks ahead. So please stay tuned on that, and we'd be happy to follow up with your office as that goes live.
In my closing seconds here, I know that equity is part of your goal and that you are shifting dollars to make sure that small disadvantaged businesses can be part of contracting. Can you talk briefly about how the department's equity focus will change when you are evaluating future infrastructure projects? And will you, give priority for those that are trying to address historic injustices or emphasize future equity?
Thank you. Yes, as briefly as I can, let me emphasize two areas in which we're focused on equity. The first is in the selection and delivery of the projects, making sure that no one is left behind, making sure that we pay attention to the opportunity to benefit overburdened and underserved communities with transportation that connects them to opportunity. The second dimension I want to mention is the opportunity for wealth creation for firms owned by historically disadvantaged owners and for workers, often belonging to groups that have historically not been able to get much of the economic benefit on the labor side. It's why we welcome the provisions in the law for efforts like local hire. And it's why we're at work to make sure that we're doing everything we can within the authorities provided by Congress to maximize the opportunity for DBEs and for businesses that have a unique opportunity to expand their capacity and their competitiveness, working on the many construction and transportation projects that will be funded in the years ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you again. My Northeast Florida district is a large logistics hub for the entire Southeast United States with both, actually airports, rail, federal highways, 2 interstate systems, ferries, seaports, and a very robust transit system. And so, as you can imagine, my district is very supportive of the investments in infrastructure that you have been proposing. And particularly, I appreciate your request that includes $37 billion in the advanced appropriations through the passage of the IIJA. And although I couldn't vote for it for a lot of other reasons, I do want to say I support you and I stand with you on on substantial investment into our infrastructure. And I just want to reiterate, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart mentioned in his opening remarks that the IIJA funding will be subject to rigorous oversight by this committee to ensure every dollar has a strong return on investment for our taxpayers. And I just want to align myself with that sentiment that he expressed earlier. I was pleased to see in your 2023 budget that it included substantial investment in our maritime industry, including strong funding for MARAD, for port infrastructure, for our Maritime Marine Academy, to ensure that we have a strong maritime workforce. And also it included $450 million in IIJA funding for $450 million for this year in that 5-year plan. So my question is, with this influx in the maritime investment, since much of this is long overdue funding from MARAD, how is DOT tracking the spending in order to provide adequate oversight to ensure that we're spending these dollars in the correct manner and following up on so that we get the best return on our dollars? And then what, if any, innovations are you thinking about concerning the implementation to make the project execution easier, like permitting and other areas like that? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. And let me say at the outset that we recognize and welcome the oversight role of this body and others in ensuring that these dollars are spent accountably. And the subject of your question is very much on my mind as the Port Infrastructure Development Program grows to levels we've not seen before. The good news is this is a program that has existed as opposed to some of the programs that are being newly created. And so I would say there's a strong level of experience and what I would call muscle memory in the department about how to effectively and efficiently make those project selections. But we need to expand our capacity, both to make sure we're choosing the right projects on the front end, and then to follow through on the back end to make sure that their delivery is efficient and that their use is compliant. This is especially timely now because these investments can help, we think, with supply chain issues and ultimately play a role in the fight against inflation. We've got to be able to move goods in and out of our ports as efficiently as possible. I'll give you 2 examples of just the range of things we're supporting here from last year's cycle. One of them was $52 million that went to on-dock rail to bring about 10,000 more feet of rail onto the Port of Long Beach so that you could get those containers moving more quickly and efficiently. But another project sort of at the other end of the spectrum in size was $1.6 million that went to a port on the Ohio River in Indiana, just across the river from Kentucky, that helps pig iron get loaded off of barges and up to a nearby foundry. So I would emphasize that communities of all sizes and ports of all sizes stand to benefit. What we want to do is make sure that we work with these project sponsors so that they understand the requirements up front and that we encourage them to be as effective and help them to be as effective and efficient as possible in deploying those dollars.
Excellent. With that, Mr. Secretary, I see my time has run out. I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you again. My constituents in California, the Inland Empire, lack good public transit options that are reliable and affordable, as well as housing options. They are often forced to commute hours to work on congested freeways. And that is why I introduced the Sustainable Communities Act, which builds on an old Obama initiative focused on transit-oriented development with new grants. And as the co-chair of the new DEM Infrastructure Task Force, I've been working to ensure transportation and housing are interconnected. The fiscal year 22 enacted bill created the Thriving Communities Initiative, providing $25 million for DOT and $5 million for HUD to facilitate technical assistance and capacity building for underserved communities in need of infrastructure improvements. The goal of the program is really to increase the proficiency of state, local, and tribal governments to plan and develop projects to increase transportation options and reliability and affordability for people to connect from their homes to work, to school, and to each other. So before we talk about DOT's fiscal year 23 request for another $111 million for the program, could you talk to us about how DOT is standing up this program? And is there a multimodal working group within DOT? And has DOT set up other working groups with federal agencies for cross-agency coordination and outreach to state, local, and tribal governments?
Well, thank you. And let me identify very much with your focus on ensuring that silos do not get in the way of recognizing that housing and transportation are intimately related. Of course, I needn't tell this committee that, but the organizational chart of the federal executive branch doesn't always reflect it. And so we've been working closely with our partners at HUD and in other agencies to make good on that insight. And certainly Thriving Communities is an important part of that. The technical assistance that comes in that place-based approach creates resources and opportunities for us to work with other partners. HUD, as I mentioned before, also potentially EPA, the Economic Development Administration within Commerce, and the Department of Agriculture. And we see ways that can create both inclusive patterns for engaging stakeholders and ways to do the sort of cross-agency work that can lead to efficient project delivery and holistic project design. So the team is at work right now in standing up the terms for that kind of technical assistance and making sure we can help communities, especially disadvantaged communities, get the most bang for our buck. And we really value the opportunity to provide that capacity building because we know sometimes it takes resources to access federal resources. And we want to make sure that's not a barrier to getting these dollars to where they could make the greatest difference.
Absolutely. And as you stated correctly, the challenges with the smaller entities. I mean, the metropolitan cities know how to do that. They have staff and can afford to hire consultant firms and teams of attorneys to help them through these processes. But oftentimes the communities like the one I represent are left behind. Through COVID, I don't have to remind you, but I'm going to say it. So many of our critical workers, I didn't realize how many of them depend on public transportation. So the fact that many of those bus lines were reduced, the train didn't often run, not to mention, all of the issues around rail safety in my community. So thank you for focusing on these issues, and I'll wait until the second round to ask my next question. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your time and your service to our beautiful nation. I want to just first of all thank you for the focus on the ports of LA as well as Long Beach. I know that was a multifaceted and complex problem, and I know that we're still experiencing some of those things. I think it would be actually very useful for this committee to, if you could, point us to a resource that shows the progress being made and what sort of the next barriers and the third and fourth level of friction and challenges that we're experiencing in our ports, just so that we can get an understanding of, now that we've sort of knocked down the low hanging fruit, what are the third and fourth order ripple effects, but we can take that offline. I just want to associate myself with some of the comments about executability. I'm deeply concerned about the dollar values here. We see big numbers, not only from the infrastructure bill, but on the annual budgets. And I just wanted to get a sense from your perspective as far as your confidence in the ability to execute some of these programs. Not only do we have a lot of dollars right now for these projects, but we also, on the heels of the Great Resignation, don't necessarily have all the bodies to staff these projects to the levels that maybe that we should be able to and absolutely need to. We had a problem before COVID, and I think that was aggravated because of COVID. And we now have a position where we literally have jobs looking for people rather than people looking for jobs. So I wanted to get your sense of how is that affecting the transportation and infrastructure projects, and sort of what's your overall level of confidence, and what is sort of the fallback plan if you see yourself underrunning on some of these projects. I know the easy button is just to keep writing more checks and spend more money, but underrunning on a government program isn't necessarily a bad thing when you have limitations outside of your control. And just wanted to get a sense, if you can, spend a minute on that. And I have one other issue I want to raise, but if you can just walk us through your thoughts on executability right now.
Thank you. These are very important challenges. Of course, the problems associated with exceptionally low unemployment are better than the problems associated with exceptionally high unemployment, but they are a real challenge when it comes to project delivery, whether we're talking about the agency itself and the hiring we need to do, or what's happening across the different sectors. And it's certainly contributed even to our supply chain challenges as we see the issues related to availability of workforce, whether we're talking about trucking, shipping, rail, or even aircraft pilots. Specifically with regard to the projects that we're rolling out, this is one of the reasons why we have a direct focus in workforce. And the law provides, in many cases, a specific set of resources to do that with. So to take one example, on the low, no emissions bus program, there's actually a 5% threshold that requires grantees to invest that much in workforce to help make sure that they can actually operate these new pieces of equipment that are coming their way. And I recently had a chance to visit a community college in Northern Ohio that's partnered directly with the transit authority there. So they'll have a very direct place to take those dollars. We're going to count on partnerships like that across the country between different organizations that are in a position to do training and those that are doing the hiring. I don't think we can afford to be hands-off about it for the very reasons that you cite. We need to deliver well. And if we're in the business of building good things well, we can't do it without actively working to expand our productive capacity.
I appreciate that. That all makes sense. Looking forward to seeing you execute and seeing the results of these investments at the macro level. Very important for our country. So we've got to do this correctly. The second issue I had is completely different. We have a bit of a jurisdictional issue with the space domain right now. We've got the NTSB asserting itself as sort of the authority for space mishap investigation work. Stepping on the toes of the FAA, I would submit that the NTSB doesn't have the domain expertise nor the capacity to fulfill this role and responsibility. And we know that the FAA and the NTSB now are working together to try to deconflict this. Quickly, though, are you aware of this sort of jurisdictional encroachment, and how do you see this getting resolved? Is there some way here where we can put this responsibility back into the hands of the FAA?
Well, thank you for the question. We certainly recognize some jurisdictional complexity and made it more theoretical before, but the growth of commercial space launches is accelerating exponentially. And so it is time for us to take a look at this. To the roles of NTSB and FAA, I would add Commerce has a role, NASA, and I think there is a lot of interest in looking at that flying formation, so to speak, and seeing if we've got it right. Of course, to the extent that that's laid out by Congress, we're running through the assignments that we have, issues like deconflicting the national airspace, concerns about the creation of space debris, but would certainly welcome a chance to work with Congress and other stakeholders if there are ways to make sure there's no confusion or complication around the jurisdictional issues, because again, the demand is only going to rise.
Yeah, we can't bloat our government even further and confuse and muddy the waters. I'm out of time, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for your time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. Don't pay attention to those bells. We just have those go off. The chairman puts those on intentionally every time Mr. Garcia speaks. So don't worry about that. Mr. Secretary, the bipartisan infrastructure law is a generational investment in clean energy and green technology that'll help us achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And I'm proud that in my district, we're home to some of this innovation that embodies the administration's continued commitment to improving transportation systems that reduce emissions. The Redlands Passenger Rail Project in Southern California will be one of the first zero-emission self-powered passenger trains in North America. The train can operate on existing rail infrastructure, allowing it to immediately deliver zero-emission passenger rail to scores of underserved communities throughout the region. Mr. Secretary, can you elaborate on the steps that the president's budget proposal and bipartisan infrastructure law take to expand access to low and no emissions transportation, specifically in historically underserved communities?
Thank you. This is a very important part of our climate agenda, just as was the electric vehicle infrastructure we discussed earlier for light-duty vehicles and privately owned cars. The Grants for Bus and Bus Facilities program, which is continued through the bipartisan infrastructure law, includes the low and no emissions competitive grants program, which is requested at the level of $73 million in funding alongside the $1.1 billion provided in advance appropriations. And what this allows us to do is support the many transit agencies and authorities that already want to adopt low and no emission bus equipment, but may not be in a position to do so. When they do, and it's not just the buses, but often required supporting facilities that they need help with. When they do, that means lower emissions, less pollution, health benefits, which are especially marked in disadvantaged communities, as well as potential taxpayer savings from the lower cost of filling them up. So we are really enthusiastic about ensuring that we get these dollars out far and wide, and agree that it'll often be in disadvantaged communities that you might see the greatest proportional benefit from an agency being able to make that move into newer technology.
Thanks for the explanation, and I'd love to invite you to visit the Redlands Passenger Rail Project when we open this fall. I also wanted to briefly mention and reference the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Supportive Services Program within the president's budget. This program helps disadvantaged business enterprises, DBEs, compete for funding for federally assisted highway projects. Can you share how DBE Supportive Services has helped minority and women-owned businesses compete for and receive grant funding for federally assisted highway projects, and how we can continue to help these small businesses compete for funding within the broader bipartisan infrastructure law?
Thank you. Yes, we had an authorization for this fiscal year, and it's reflected that in the budget request that we would request to continue this program because it supports the ability of state departments of transportation to achieve the objectives of their DBE programs. So knowing that ultimately the bulk of this transportation funding goes out through the states, supporting them in providing the kind of training, the kind of technical assistance to DBEs is one of the best things that we can do to make good on the potential of this generational investment to create generational wealth, and often for employees, workers from backgrounds that have been disadvantaged or excluded in the past. No one has a better track record of employing them than DBE firms. This funding can be used to help these firms improve their business practices, overcome barriers to success, ultimately to facilitate their development into viable organizations that are successful in a competitive environment in competing for and in performing on these federally assisted projects. So we work closely with the states to make sure these dollars are effectively used, and we really welcome the tools that Congress has given us to provide that kind of help.
What other tools does the department need in utilizing this program and as you roll this out? I would just say also that the funding level for this DBE supportive services has been capped at $10 million since 1973. Senator Padilla and I introduced a bill to raise the funding cap to $25 million that can help programs that affect FAA and FTA as well. But what else can we do to help?
Well, as you mentioned, certainly the more resources there are for us to work with, the more businesses we can help and the more geographies we can help them in. And right now, through the states, this is federal highway focused, but to be able to do so across other modes would potentially allow for businesses that aren't working in areas that are currently supported to see that this is a program for them too. I should mention also that we as the department are in the process of adopting more ambitious SDB goals for our own direct procurement. But what's so helpful about the DBESS program specifically is it enhances the ability of DBEs to participate not just in the dollars that are directly contracted or procured by my department, but in those formula dollars that the states are ultimately spending.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Henson, I believe you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you again as well. We bring Midwest greetings, and it's actually for once warmer in the Midwest than it is here in DC. So thank you again for appearing before our committee. There are clearly a lot of impressive happenings at the DOT, innovations, as we've heard already today, to help with global competitiveness, investment in rural development, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on those efforts. And about a year ago, we had a discussion about wanting to simplify, obviously, the forms and the grant process, and so I was very encouraged to hear about what's happening with the websites and trying to make that more user-friendly as well. So I'm very excited to hear more about your work there, but just wanted to raise a quick alarm about a couple of things. Number one, I think there's a couple of areas in the budget that I think spend quite a bit of taxpayer money on programs that won't really help Iowans. And a couple of those areas, specifically billions of dollars for Amtrak train lines. Obviously, that's all going to go to the Northeast Corridor. People living between New York and DC will get a lot of that money. It's already one of the most heavily funded public transportation corridors in the country. And you also mentioned the $1 billion investment just to build out the network of electric vehicle chargers. And, Iowans see that as $1 billion investment in China for critical mineral production. And Iowans have been very clear with me, they don't want to send their tax dollars to China to help with electric vehicle charging stations that we can't really use right now. When you look at the numbers in Iowa, about a tenth of 1% of the registered vehicles in my district are electric vehicles. So Iowans right now are not trading in their affordable vehicles, their reliable vehicles, their farm trucks for impractical, luxury, expensive electric vehicles that can't go more than 200 miles without recharging. And a couple things there. First, these EVs were not really built with rural Americans' long distances across counties to get to childcare and work. I just visited a place where people are driving 40 miles each way to and from childcare 2 times a day. That completely depletes your ability to go anywhere else. Secondly, Iowans can't afford it. I just talked with a mom in Waterloo who's concerned about her shrinking paycheck, covering the rising costs that she's facing, gas and groceries, not buying a new electric vehicle that costs, respectfully, $50,000 to $60,000 on average. And adding charging stations and then suggesting that people should be out there buying a new electric vehicle is truly an out of touch response to what my constituents are facing right now. So I just wanted to ask specifically today, Mr. Secretary, when it comes to these investments in electric vehicles and $16 million investment in electric vehicles, can you describe where that specifically would go?
Sure. So first of all, let me put to rest some misconceptions about electric vehicles and ones that would, I think, be especially interesting to your constituents. So let's take the electric trucks that are coming onto the market, say a Silverado or a F-150 Lightning, for example. Those are all electric models. They start about $40,000 and they have a range in the 200 to 300 plus mile area. And it's actually rural drivers who would benefit the most. I mean, think about some of the drivers you mentioned, right? The more they drive, typically the more of their income is going to gas. And so the more money they're going to save if they can afford an electric vehicle, which allows them to fill up on electrons. So of course, that's not free
Well,
either.
but electrons
but
are
it
more
is
expensive
cheaper.
right now too, Mr. Secretary. I mean, when you look at, I have constituents sending me copies of their electric bills that have more than doubled in the last year too. So when it comes to energy affordability, that is the issue here. No matter what fuel you're using, everything is more expensive right now. So that's why I'm saying respectfully here that electric vehicles are not the answer right now when we're facing these energy affordability crises across the board.
So again, it is less expensive to fill up on electricity than it is to fill up on gas and diesel. That's only the more true recently, but that's been true for some time. And so part of what we're trying to do here is to make sure that families can get the savings. Now, as you know, we also propose tax credits that would have knocked another $10,000, $12,000 off of the price of those vehicles. So that, for example, F-150 or Silverado that would start at 40, that would get into the high 20s for your constituents. Now, some members voted for that, some members voted against it. We believe it would be a nice complement to what we do have the funding from Congress to do, which is to make those chargers available. Now, one other thing that I think is especially worth mention in areas like the Midwest where you and I come from is that while it's still going to be important to have this kind of electric vehicle infrastructure across the highway network for those longer road trips, well, what a lot of folks don't realize is that many people, especially in rural areas where a majority of families live in single family homes, have electric vehicle infrastructure already. It's called the plug in your wall. In other words, an ordinary wall plug, while of course not as fast as a level 2 charger or something like that, is something that can be used to charge a family vehicle. Look, we're in a race against time. We are seeing effects, some of which have been experienced, certainly in Iowa, of disturbingly frequent and extreme weather events related to climate. Many scientists believe we're within just a few years of a point of no return. And we have technology that exists right now that's creating American jobs that can save American taxpayers money today on their gas or diesel bills if we just act to make sure that it's affordable, which is what those tax credits are about, and act to make sure that we have that kind of charging infrastructure. So, even with a 300-mile range, we know that that's not going to work for everybody with longer driving patterns. We could help them, and we will using this funding. I don't want to miss the opportunity just to let you know something else I think you'll be relieved to hear on the Amtrak side, which is that if you look, for example, at the 23 budget and the $3 billion requested for Amtrak, 1.2 billion of that is for the Northeast corridor, 1.8 for the national network. So I would hate for anybody to go out thinking that this was only going to the Northeast corridor. That's certainly, of course, where a lot of the passengers, a lot of the revenue, a lot of the economic activity connected to Amtrak is. But the vision really is for a nationwide network that'll benefit this country coast to coast.
Mr.
Thank you,
Espion.
Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
Mr. Espion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Secretary. As you know, the Second Avenue subway, the second phase of the Second Avenue subway project has been on the pipeline for some time now, and under your leadership, in partner with the MTA, significant progress has been made. This year, my constituent and I were pleased to see a funding of fiscal year 23 funding recommendations included of $400 million for construction of the second phase of the Second Avenue subway. This is an excellent sign that the project is right on track and that the next and final phase should begin by the end of this year. I hope that you can visit the tunnels with me. I know that you were scheduled to, but I again extend an invitation to you to visit that wonderful project that addresses equity, transportation equity for East Harlem and Harlem and my district. My question is, when deciding the annual report on funding recommendations for capital investment grant program projects, is project readiness taken into consideration when this decision is made, Secretary?
Well, thank you. Yes, one of the most important things, of course, in programming these funds is to make sure that the project sponsors are going to be able to implement and execute. And I know that, by the way, I haven't forgotten the opportunity and invitation to come see the Second Avenue subway. I'm looking forward to it. And as you know, that's part of the broader body of the transit vision that would be funded in this budget request with 2.9 billion in general funds, which coupled with the 1.6 that came in advance appropriations brings us to 4.5 billion for the year. But yeah, certainly it was a statutorily defined set of criteria that's specific to each project type. But we work very closely with project sponsors to make sure that they can be delivered effectively.
Thank you, Secretary. I want to jump into another question. While the Infrastructure and Jobs Act was not designed to achieve the Biden's administration climate, the climate commitments, it does provide funding for programs that can help reduce pollution and prepare communities to resiliency against climate impact. What measures will you enforce to guarantee that Justice 40 is adhered to when implementing programs under the Infrastructure and Job Acts that invest in clean energy, clean transportation, green buildings, workforce development, grid and transmission updates, recycling, and clean water? What enforcement mechanism or what measures will you take?
So one thing that's going to be very important is transparency about how we're meeting those goals. And I can tell you that this Justice 40 commitment is taken seriously in my department and in all of the covered programs across the infrastructure law. That's the expectation of the president, the public, and the Congress alike. Of course, we've been working with equity in mind even before the bill passed. To take one example from your neighborhood, the $18 million planning grant for the Cross Bronx Expressway planning work in fiscal 22 out of RAISE, I think is an example of something that's compelling, largely because it can benefit people.
That may be my district in a couple of months, Secretary. So.
We'll keep our eyes peeled on that. And either way, I know something that will affect your constituents. So I just want to mention that as an example of the work we've been doing before. But now with Justice 40 and with the resources in the bill, we have an opportunity to really take these commitments to the next level. And you have my commitment that as we work with OMB to make sure that we spell out the specific implementation and metrics for measuring the keeping of those promises, that's something that we'll be tracking all the way at my level in the White House and throughout this department.
Mr. Chairman, let me just thank the Secretary for his persistent commitment to transportation across the nation and infrastructure, and of course to the environmental issues that are connected to transportation and infrastructure that are so important to the neighborhoods like the ones that I represent. And I just look forward to having the Secretary visit Harlem, East Harlem, as we plan to connect that neighborhood to the rest of the world. And I thank him for all his efforts thus far. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for attending today. I represent South and West Texas. I represent 42% of the southern border, a district that is predominantly Hispanic. My first question to you is, when is the last time you visited the southern border?
Good question. I guess it's been probably 2 or 3 years since I was in that area.
I'd love to host you there because there's a lot, you see a lot of things on TV, but there's a lot more to that area than just the security piece. The security piece is absolutely important, but there is trade and commerce that is equally as important in there. And infrastructure plays a fundamental role in all of that. Have you ever heard the name Bishop Evans?
Yes, that is familiar.
Okay, Bishop Evans was a National Guardsman that drowned a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, of course, yes.
In Eagle Pass, Texas. And I mention his name is because we're seeing all kinds of people get sucked up into this chaos. And I'm bringing it back to infrastructure. A lot of times along those areas, especially Eagle Pass, Del Rio, and I'd argue even Yuma area, you have a lack of infrastructure. And what does that mean? When there's a crisis or when there's a situation, emergency situation, a life or death situation, it requires, Border Patrol or any agency to have access to some of these different areas. And one of the difficulties was getting access to that river and ultimately, them recovering his body. So I'd love to host you if you ever decide to come down or help you build out a trip. If you decide to do that, I think it's very important beyond the security piece, but to spend some time and energy in that. Along those lines, we often talk about seaports, and I think seaports are important, but there's also land ports that I think have been overlooked quite a bit. And I have several land ports in my district. And I think what you're going to see as these increased, delays in, certain ports, seaports, you're going to see the land ports be an alternative route to that. On that note, is there anything in particular that your organization is working on for land ports as far as modernizing and streamlining some of that ability?
Thank you, and certainly agree that the story of making sure that our borders are functioning well is largely an infrastructure story, and that is as true for land ports of entry, through which a great deal of commerce and trade passes, as it is for our seaports. And there is a lot available. First of all, of course, making sure our road networks are adequate, and other resources in the infrastructure law. One of many reasons we thank Congress for passing the infrastructure law is the financial support that it provides for land ports of entry that I know will be important at the border.
Right, I'm just going to double down on that. As you know, the Aviation Safety Division specializes in basic and advanced training courses in aircraft and rotorcraft accident investigations and safety management systems, SMS. The Aviation Safety Division provides training and technical assistance to the Interagency Committee on the Aviation Policy, Customs and Border Patrol, and the Army and Air Force National Guard. I appreciate the department working with CBP agents and many others in my district to help secure the border. On that note, I'd love for you to look into that and find ways on how, the interagency cooperation is very important, and all of it is intertwined. And, if you could look in and, maybe we can have a dialogue on how we can expand some of these areas, because transportation is very critical, as we've kind of outlaid.
I would welcome a chance to work with you on that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. My last question is honestly in regards to electric vehicles. And, we often talk about, whether some districts will benefit or not benefit from it. I honestly, I don't want to have that discussion. I prefer to talk about the rare earth minerals in it and what are we doing, as far as, China has a grapple hold on this. And, what are we doing to kind of compete in that area when it comes to, the components of what makes an electric vehicle work?
Thank you. This is a very important dimension of how we're going to need to work to prepare for the future, especially in order to maximize the job creation potential of EV production and supply chains in the U.S., not to mention just making sure that the supply is adequate. I would mention not only the availability, mining, and extraction of rare earth elements, but also the refining capacity for them. If you look at some of the elements that are important in EVs, the reason that there is a disproportionate level coming from China actually has less to do with the elements than it does the capacity to prepare them for being usable. And this is exactly the kind of issue that the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation that was established linking our department to the Department of Energy is working on. I think, these issues, of course, cannot be used as an excuse to maintain the status quo, but also cannot be ignored and need to be tackled with energy, with resources, and with determination. We're seeing a lot of the industry, the OEMs, taking very creative and innovative steps to diversify the kinds of technologies that they have, because some of the sources actually do exist in the U.S. if we make the most of them. Lithium is a good example of that, while others like cobalt are much harder to source in the U.S. or even in friendly countries, creating some pressure to look for alternatives that wouldn't require them to be used as much. But again, we see a lot of industry leadership, and we think that deserves to be matched by public sector leadership in supporting that kind of supply chain development, so that we can really be ready for what we are sure is going to be a transition to electric in the auto industry, but are not sure is going to happen quickly enough unless we're all working together.
Thank you, Ms. Secretary. You're back.
Ms. Wexton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us here today. It's great to have you back with us. Now, I would be remiss if I did not at least congratulate you and Jason on the new arrivals that you've had since you last appeared before us. And just, I do feel the need to point out that you look incredibly well rested. And so I don't know what your secret is, and maybe you can tell me about it in round two. But right now, I want to talk some about transit, if we may. I would be remiss also if I did not thank the administration and your department for your continued support of Metro in the FY23 budget request. It's really important that we get that up and running because, as more and more federal workers return to work and need to take transit, they're returning to transit, as well as people who are trying to save money on gas as gas prices increase. So we're seeing a big uptick in the people riding on Metro. So I want to say thank you for making sure that WMATA will be able to provide safe, frequent, and reliable service for the region. And I do remember that when you were last before us last year, we talked a little bit about the fact that phase 2 will be opening the Silver Line will be opening in my district. I had hoped it would be open by now. It is not yet open. I do remain confident that will open in FY23 sometime, if not before. And I would like to maintain that open invitation for you to join us for the ribbon cutting when it does take place.
Well, that's something I share your enthusiasm for and look forward to being able to celebrate. And thank you for the kind words about our family too. By the same token, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that today WMATA named a new executive director and CEO, somebody I got to know through terrific work that went on in Austin. And I'm wishing him every success and look forward to working with him and his team.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Secretary Buttigieg. I also want to ask you about the Integrated Smart Mobility Pilot Program that's proposed in the Federal Transit Administration's budget request. I'm really intrigued by this because, as I mentioned, Silver Line Phase 2 is coming into Loudoun County. It's still a very suburban county, and we have trouble with that first mile, last mile, linkages, and also with things like paratransit and microtransit and things like that. How do you envision this pilot program working to help better connect people to transit in all areas?
So what I would say is that our transit systems are part of a tapestry that looks very different than it did even 10 years ago, let alone 20, 50 or more when many of these systems were established. And the assumption that the best approach is always going to be a fixed line hub and spoke door-to-door or neighborhood-to-neighborhood system has been complicated, but perhaps possibly in a good way by the arrival of things like micromobility, bike share, scooters, ride share and other technologies that, if we think of them right, I think could be a complement to, not a replacement for, transit. So this is a discretionary grant program. $50 million requested in this budget would allow FTA to award up to 5 grants to eligible recipients. And the idea would be to support innovative approaches to mobility that improve safety, accessibility, and equity in accessing community services or economic opportunities or getting people to where they need to be, to put it simply. So that means things that might, for example, integrate active transportation or shared use mobility with public transportation improvements so that we have just a safer, better, and more up-to-date model for transit. And I think while 50 million might seem to be a modest number relative to federal transit spending writ large, I think we can learn from what works through these smart mobility grants in ways that could inform ultimately the entirety of transportation and transit investment across the U.S.
Good, and I would suggest that you guys, when you do award those pilot program grants, that assuming that that's funded, you do so to a diverse area when it comes to geography and everything like that. Some to suburban areas, some to urban areas, and things like that. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the airport terminal program at the FAA that we created in the bipartisan infrastructure law. I represent 4 airports, 3 regional and 1 international, and they're all really, really excited about this. Everything from, the Manassas Regional Airport, which really needs a new tower, Winchester, which is looking to hopefully build a new terminal there, and obviously Dulles International Airport, which is way behind on their construction of Terminal C. What kind of impacts are you hoping that this program will have, and can you talk a little bit about how the department plans to allocate the grants to ensure that there's a diversity of recipients, that it's not just, for example, the big international airports, but it also includes the regional airports and smaller airports?
Thank you. And as a former mayor of a community that really relied on our regional airport, I know how important it is to support airports of all sizes and types. So the infrastructure law provides $5 billion over 5 years specifically for terminal development projects. That is set out per the law to ensure that we consider replacing aging infrastructure as one of the specific areas that's held in mind when selecting projects. And those grant funds can be used for upgrades or replacement of aging terminal or airport-owned air traffic control tower projects. So I think it's certainly one that could be applicable to the scenario that you mentioned, and something that we had put out for solicitation and are now going through the applications from that first tranche of the funding. Really looking forward to making some announcements that I hope will demonstrate our commitment to supporting airports of all sizes and types.
Thank you, Mr. Trone.
Judge, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Chairman Price, for holding this hearing today, and Secretary Buttigieg. Lots happened since you were here last time. We've had some great, wonderful progress in transportation, so we thank you for that. Finally, we're going to be able to rebuild our roads and bridges and bring our infrastructure. In my district, will allow communities like Frederick and Cumberland, Maryland to read. The IIJA included one of my bills, finished the ADHS Act, which delivered 100% of the funding needed to finish Maryland portion around 219. And for that, we thank you. On surface transportation, for the first time, you're allowing grants to apply for multiple grants with one application. It's a great idea. How's that going to look on the back end? And will the criteria be the same across grant programs?
Well, thank you for highlighting the work we're doing to try to make it just a little bit simpler for project applicants to navigate our processes and for our staff to go through these applications. 46 new programs were created in the DOT alone through the infrastructure law. And we want to make sure that that doesn't lead to a bewildering array of different programs with different requirements, different dates, different processes, because of course that will be especially difficult for smaller communities or disadvantaged communities, but really difficult for any community to navigate. So our intention with rolling some of these projects up together, for example, combining the infra program, the rural surface program, and the mega program together, is to make it a simpler, streamlined process for applicants and allow us to weigh different funding sources that could all perhaps be applicable to the same project and issue that decision, go through that process all at once. Now, sometimes the selection criteria are set out in rather specific terms by statute. In all cases, we usually have to create a little more specificity around that. And our intention is to be very transparent in the notice of funding opportunity so applicants know what to expect. And I think we're going to learn a lot from this first year of combined notices of funding opportunity. And it goes well, perhaps even be able to take further steps in that direction.
I think that's fantastic. Infra is going to continue to be the key federal grant program. Do you anticipate being able to award more grants as you have so much more funding available, and any criteria changes on infra that's significant from this year, from last year?
So the answer to the first question is yes. We've gone from the neighborhood of $1 billion to the neighborhood of 1.5, thanks to the funding that was provided in the bill. And so I would expect that will allow us to support more programs, more projects than before, which is welcome because this is a very popular and oversubscribed program where we got more applications, and I would say more deserving applications than we were able to fund. The criteria are broadly consistent, and again, as we put out these notices of funding opportunity, we try to be as transparent as we can about how we're putting those criteria to work and what applicants can expect. We also try to work with applicants on the back end if something doesn't go their way. Sometimes they can successfully reapply in a second or a third year, and we're pleased to see an application go back and get stronger. There are some new eligibilities in infra, wildlife crossing projects, which I think sometimes sounds fanciful for people who maybe don't live in areas where that's important, but that can really save lives in terms of reducing the number of large animal strikes on some roads. marine highway corridor projects, certain projects on our national multimodal freight network, other things that we think would be relevant to our supply chains. So there are some new eligibilities that we would encourage project sponsors to become familiar with, so that they know that this project just might be, this program just might be for them, even if it wasn't necessarily in the past.
That's fantastic. And great news. I want to take a plug for Maryland I-81 grant application. We've applied, as you mentioned, actually 4 years and gotten better and better every year in our application. This project, I-81, carries 12% of the United States GDP, 12%, in desperate need of federal funding. It's got over 19,000 trucks every day in the top 1% of truck traffic per lane. And we've only got 9 exits. And the problem with the exits is they're 50 years old. They're 800 to 900 feet. And we need 1,500 feet now for standard, for safety. So we'd love for you to put a good word in for I-81. And thank you for the great job you've done so far. We really, really appreciate all your hard work there. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Secretary, for being here. I did get the opportunity to hear the majority of your testimony. Then, unfortunately, I had to go and do another hearing. But first of all, let me just say that I am glad that it is President Biden in the White House right now, and I am very glad that you are the Secretary of Transportation, because the issues that I am very concerned about, you've already been addressing. I want to talk to you a little bit about this whole issue of reconnecting neighborhoods. You've mentioned this in hearings that we've had before, what's happened with the kind of policies that were implemented that disconnected very important neighborhoods. And I'm thrilled that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has included funding for reconnecting these communities. I want to ask you if you could provide me any further details as to the timeline of these grants and what localities should be aware of and when applying. I want to thank you also because I did have someone from your office on an information panel discussion, but I'd really like to know how are these neighborhoods that have been most impacted will know about these grants and will know how to apply for them.
Well, thank you very much for the question. One thing I've found about cases where a past decision about infrastructure has divided a community is that they're everywhere. I'm amazed to see heads nodding when I describe that railroad track or that highway that tore through a community of color or divides one neighborhood from another, even if I don't know specifically which one that would mean to somebody in my audience. We've seen it in communities of every size, north, south, east, and west. And so we know that there's a great deal of interest in this program. This year's funding amounts to $195 million, and we intend to put out the notice of funding opportunity by the end of June of this year. This is one of those new programs, so it's taking some work to get it just right, as opposed to an expansion of an existing one. But we also want to move promptly because I suspect that we will see a remarkable level of demand for this. The kinds of projects we're looking for are ones that can use federal dollars to improve or reconnect where federal dollars in the past divided. I would say there might be many different types or flavors, so to speak, of those projects. What's called a cap and stitch, where you go over a highway that might create that kind of gash, or sometimes a more modest intervention, like adding a transit route where it doesn't make sense to completely replace a piece of infrastructure, but you need to help people get across or around it. We'll make that a little more specific and clear in the grant criteria. But the other thing I would want to mention is while this pilot program funds projects that are specifically geared toward this, there's nothing to stop a number of other bodies of funding, discretionary and formula, from being used in ways that align with these kinds of purposes. And so my hope is that states, as they use their formula funding, might take note of what's achieved through this pilot program and decide independently that they might want to take some similar steps on their own.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is wonderful. And I represent the capital of the state of New Jersey, the very historic city of Trenton. And it has been cut off from its access to the waterfront. which would make it even more attractive to both its tourism and economic development. I want to extend an invitation to you to come see this with me, explore this, and use your creativity as we discuss what has happened negatively in terms of our capital city and what could happen under any one of these programs. So right now I'm extending that invitation. Please know that my office will follow up and hope that we can get you into the city of Trenton and the great state of New Jersey. The other project that I'm really, or funding stream that I'm really interested in is this whole making streets more healthy. I introduced a bill called the Shade Act, which would have put $50 million over a 5 or so year period, which would help those communities that have really been experiencing higher temperatures, unhealthier environments, breathing air, et cetera. They've been traditionally the red line districts, they're the poorer districts, and they're minority districts. And I'm wondering, what is it that you all will be doing to notify those particular communities of their eligibility for cooling down mechanisms?
So I would point to the sources of funding around things like complete streets, where often an important design element is making sure that they address issues like this that are not just an aesthetic concern, but as you point out, often a health concern as well. They can affect the even the physical sustainability or durability of infrastructure because of the accumulating heat that happens in hard infrastructure that could otherwise be somewhat sheltered through things like tree canopy. And so we'd welcome the chance to work with your office to lay out in a little more detail which funding sources might have overlapping eligibilities that could be helpful for communities that are including these elements in their project design.
Thank you, sir. I see that my time has expired. I yield back. I thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you. And that does conclude our first round of questioning. It's really good and impressive to have virtually all hands on deck from the subcommittee, both sides of the aisle, with good questions. I think we covered a wide waterfront, and we'll have a second round that'll give us another chance. We're not wanting to keep you too long, Ms. Secretary, but we appreciate your sticking with us here, and we'll proceed. I will ask members to do their best to frame their question so as to give the Secretary time to answer within the 5 minutes. We need to do a little better in moving along. But I will start the second round, and we'll be happy to entertain anyone who wants to stay with us and participate. I noted in my opening statement that like Amtrak Joe, I consider myself an advocate for passenger rail. The $66 billion in advanced appropriations provided across several rail programs over 5 years in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act does have the potential to really transform passenger rail in the U.S., upgrading present services, hopefully adding new service. And then there's, of course, a lot of other action as well with not just Amtrak, but Amtrak in cooperation with the states like North Carolina and Virginia, actively advancing projects, leveraging CRISI and other programs. We've invested heavily in them as a subcommittee, and they're, of course, including in the IIJA. So others are just beginning to explore this, but the potential is very great. So, Ms. Secretary, my question in brief is, what's your vision? What's the administration's vision for passenger rail in this country? What steps are you doing to prepare potential applicants to apply for the funding, applicants who want to build on their progress thus far, others who may want to break into this, states and other entities? What kind of advice do you have in terms of lining up for this and making a solid effort? And what kind of, I guess, planning and coordination, of course, in cooperation with Amtrak, are you undertaking so as to make sure that these pieces in the end add up to a system, I would say, of workable regional corridors? Whatever else we do, we ought to end up in addressing these corridors that are such obvious candidates for passenger rail. What kind of criteria about project readiness and and the dates for project completion? Any criteria we should know about as to how you're approaching this?
Well, thank you. The vision, in short, is that American citizens ought to be able to expect just as high a standard of passenger rail as citizens in any other developed country. I think we know that that's not true today through no fault of Amtrak's, through the fact that we haven't invested in passenger rail to the same degree as other countries have done. Amtrak, but not only Amtrak, and that there are a number of different possibilities, including public-private partnerships that have emerged to help provide excellent passenger rail for Americans. And also, again, want to emphasize that while, of course, a lot of the need and a lot of the opportunities on the Northeast border is $12 billion, for example, for the federal state partnership program across that 66 in IIJA funding dedicated toward rail is for the specifically non-Northeast corridor projects. You also mentioned CRISI, $5 billion for all sorts of rail-related infrastructure projects. And while many of them might, in the first instance, be envisioned as related to freight rail, because these freight rail lines host Amtrak passenger service, it really is a win-win for goods movement fluidity, supply chains, and passenger capabilities when we have that. Also, we have the railroad crossing elimination program. Partly there's a lot of communities where people have to wait for too long or worse, experience safety hazards around railroad crossings, including a number of communities around my Indiana hometown. But of course, that also enhances fluidity and reliability for passenger and freight service. So there's really a variety of rail projects that can be supported here, and there will be, we know, a lot of variability around the design and the urgency for those. FRA is working to make sure that information is clearly available to rail stakeholders so that they can succeed, so that they can compete, so that they can apply for these funds, because even the major investment here, since Amtrak's inception, it is not infinite, and choices will have to be made about where those dollars will make the big difference, the biggest difference, both on and off the Northeast corridor.
That's encouraging to hear. Believe me, this is long overdue. This was one of the more visionary aspects of the Obama recovery plan. $8 billion in that instance applied to passenger rail development. We made good use of it in North Carolina to develop the Raleigh to Charlotte service, four trains each way each day. Very good service. And our vision is to extend on to Richmond and on to DC. And there are a lot of regions in this country where that kind of initiative is either underway or is going to get underway, I think, with the possibility of this support. All right, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in December, DOT released guidelines to the states for their highway formula funds that many thought appeared to reduce their decision-making flexibility. And I'm sure you've heard about it, because at a minimum, this has caused confusion and concern among state DOTs. I have to tell you that discouraging new capacity could, frankly, be really ill-advised as we're dealing with supply chain issues. But I've then read and heard that obviously the intention was not to do that. Do you intend to clarify? My understanding is that there's been no clarification after that was released. Do you intend to clarify your guidance to the state so that they have, total assurances that their flexibilities and authorities under the law remain intact?
Certainly, if there's any remaining confusion or misconceptions, I'm happy to address that. If the concern is to make it clear that the memo does not prohibit the construction of new general purpose capacity on highways and bridges, I should emphasize that that fact verbatim is in the memo. What we sought to do was to lay out priorities that we think are important to bear in mind, but we recognize that this is going to be different in different jurisdictions and environments. There are some places where. Okay.
No, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, but there was some confusion. And so I think, I'm hearing from you now, but obviously, hopefully hopefully the states have now been reassured. Let me change gears. there was a lot of conversations with other members about this kind of issue. I want to make sure that there's maximum accountability and transparency in decision making. We're dealing with particularly with discretionary grant programs, and I don't have to tell you that there's a lot of money there. The IIJA advanced appropriations provided $100 billion for new discretionary non-formula programs, and this is above the amounts provided through the Highway Trust Fund and through annual appropriations. So it's a staggering amount, and again, a lot of folks have been talking about this. Last week, OMB released a 14-page guidance memo on the implementation. But one of the areas that I thought may have been overlooked is an effort to provide transparency and accountability to the public. I didn't see any specific measures to increase public access and to the way decisions are made in determining which projects get funded. This is an issue that happens, no matter who's in control, what party or what the secretary is. So I think we should work together on a few issues, Mr. Secretary. I would like to provide the public with access to deliberations by DOT, to DOT's grant application review panels, maybe through open meetings or other forms of reporting. And also, I think we should provide specific information for grantees. And you talked about how you've been, talking to grantees who maybe had not done well originally, and maybe coming back with better proposals. I think we should provide specific information for grantees when they don't succeed, as to why they were not successful, so they can do a better job when they come back. So, Mr. Secretary, would you agree with some of these transparency goals? And if so, are you willing to take specific steps to give the public more access of internal funding decisions? And I look forward to working with you on those issues.
We'll certainly recognize how important it is that our decisions are accountable and the public has a clear view of why we're making them and where taxpayer dollars are going. I'll mention a few things that we think will help with this in our plans looking forward. One is to provide individual debriefs to unsuccessful applicants so that they understand how a decision was reached, and maybe most importantly, understand how to strengthen their application for the future. I also know that under the infrastructure law in the mega grant program, we will be publishing the overall rating that was assigned to each of the eligible projects that was considered, and would be open to discussion about other measures that could be helpful too. Our goal, of course, is to do it in a balanced way that preserves appropriate levels of discretion in the department and allows us to discuss things very candidly with project sponsors. And at the same time, make sure that there's appropriate public understanding about what is happening with what is, of course, ultimately public money.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree that there are, some conversations have to be kept somewhat private, but I think obviously it is important because we're talking about so much money that the people feel confident that the decisions are being made in a transparent way, in a way that's, in the public good. And so again, it's not a criticism at all to you or to the DOT right now. It's just an issue that has come up from time to time. And I look forward to working with you and the chairman of the subcommittee on ways that we can increase that transparency as much as possible. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary. I know it's a long day. Coming back from COVID, and we still have issues, but we're talking about getting people back into transit programs and the resistance there. One of the issues in Chicago, and clearly we understand it across the country, is the issue of crime. Part of it stems from sort of a chicken and egg, which comes first. There are people who have reservations getting into transit systems that have not a lot of people on the train or the bus. They feel less secure. And it blocks people from wanting to get on because they don't see anybody there. But to get more people on, they have to be more secure. Has DOT started talking about, or their assets and assistance we can provide to help transit agencies address these concerns?
Well, certainly both the reality and the perception of safety are very important for public confidence in transit. We know that this has been a concern raised by a number of transit agencies. There are some delineations of authority between what's appropriate for us to work on versus law enforcement or or other entities, but we certainly welcome any opportunities we can provide that could be helpful here. And one thing I would point to is the hard infrastructure around anything from the design of an entrance to a subway stop to the lighting around a bus shelter could play a role in safety, even if it is funded with other considerations in mind as well. Ultimately, density of ridership tends to contribute to both the perception and the reality of safety. And so that's going to be an ongoing journey, of course, as we work to see transit ridership recover from its COVID depths. The last thing I'll mention, though, a more general point about safety that I think is somewhat missed, which is that if you look at the statistics on the number of roadway fatalities we experience in ordinary car travel, a very high number that we're working aggressively to lower. By comparison, there's a much higher degree of safety per passenger mile associated with the use of transit. I don't think it maybe works that way psychologically for us as commuters, but I do think that it bears mention that the more excellent transit options that we're providing that people feel confident and convenient are convenient to take, at least on today's patterns of roadway and transit safety, there's a safety benefit to be had there too.
Yeah, and I just had I know you mentioned lighting, entrance design, and so forth. If I might throw in the possibility of cameras, people's perception of that, I don't know if that falls in, but it's certainly something we're interested in. Any other barriers that you've seen and how we get back the density that you talked about besides crime issues?
Well, if you look overall at transit ridership, rebounded to about 60% of pre-pandemic levels, which is considerably higher than it was in late summer, fall 2020. But that average, as averages are, can be a little bit misleading. The recovery's actually been swifter in terms of bus usage. And slower in terms of subway and train usage. Now, some of that I think just reflects what's happening in terms of commuting patterns, but it's something that we want to watch carefully and integrate into our strategies for helping transit fully recover.
All right, thank you so much. I yield back.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first, I'd like to say thank you to you and President Biden. I know early on y'all came out very supportive of the Jones Act, and we do appreciate that. I think it's very important to our national security, actually, and so thank you for that. I would point out one other thing on the IIJA, in the federal bridge program. When you see these applications come through from the state of Florida, would you please consider one thing in the formula? The state of Florida has done a very good job of expending our tax dollars to keep our bridges safe and in excellent condition. Now that seems to be working against us through this formula, actually to about the tune of $200 million a year. So over the 5-year period of the grant program, that's going to be, or the bridge program, that's going to be about $1 billion. So if you would just think kindly of us when you look at that, okay? And then what I'd like to ask for an update on, Mr. Secretary, the tanker security program, I believe, is also highly important to our national security. The idea that our military has to continue to rely on fuel delivered by foreign tankers is, I think it's just unconscionable. Can you tell us a little bit about what the status on that program is? As you know, that was put into the NDAA in 2021. We funded it in 22. Actually, Transcom, US Transcom even looked at it back in 21 and affirmed that it was necessary, and that's why we funded it in 22. So there's no doubt that it's a necessary effort. Can you tell me where we're at in that effort?
Well, thank you. Yes, we agree that this, like the Jones Act in general, but this tanker security program in particular is a matter of economic and even national security. We had $60 million in funding for that for this fiscal year, and the budget requests another 60 to continue the program at that authorized level going into fiscal 23. And the way that would break down would be $6 million per vessel for up to 10 tanker vessels. Now, what we are encountering is the complexity of setting up this program and getting it up and running, especially because it entails likely reflagging some or most of the vessels that would be eligible into this program, and getting them onto the registry includes crew issues, making sure that physical inspections are passed, making sure that the Coast Guard is able to sign off. And so there are a lot of steps that have to happen here, but we're committed to going through those steps. And MARAD has told me that their goal is to have a rule in place that would enable them to begin receiving applications by the end of this calendar year.
By the end of this calendar year?
Correct.
Excellent, excellent. Because I think every month we delay this is a real challenge for our military. So with that, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker, I thank you. Listen, I want to ask one other question. I've got 1 minute left. This will be a short question. You mentioned earlier about knocking down the price of EVs. Are we going to knock that down? Are we going to get the manufacturers to knock down the price, or are we actually going to ask taxpayers to pay for a piece of that price?
Well, right now, the approach has been to call for both, but of course, the Senate has not acted on the extension of the tax credit that would have encouraged swifter adoption. But certainly the OEMs are working in this direction too. Like many things, there are economies of scale. This is relatively new and a very small percentage of sales today. The president has made a commitment to work toward 50% of sales by 2030 being EVs, and many of the companies have made comparable or even more aggressive commitments. Let me say this in terms of the philosophical reason why you would consider a policy intervention. Just as we have those $7,500 tax credits that have existed through past legislation. We think that the transition to EV will happen one way or the other. What's not guaranteed is three questions. Will it happen quickly enough to help us meet our climate goals? Will it happen in a way that people can access it who wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise, including some of the people who might benefit the most from the gas savings, provided they can afford that upfront cost? And third, will it be made in America? We see fierce competition, as we always have, in the automotive industry, and that's going to be true more than ever as that industry goes electric.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And you know, I still think we need to see those comparisons of a carbon footprint per mile for all the different fuel sources. Thank you very much, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you know how excited I am about the Portal Bridge, and that we're almost at the full commitment to that Portal Bridge, even included in this FY23 budget. So we're going to be able to get to the tunnels and safety and security and not have to worry about manually lifting or lowering. What's the next step for our tunnels though? What should we be doing, and what can we do to help us get there?
So there are several funding streams that have been created or expanded under the infrastructure law that could be applicable here across the bridges and tunnels that comprise the overall Gateway project. I would also note with appreciation that the Gateway Development Commission has identified a director, a leader. We think that is a very important step in the capacity of the GDC to help deliver on that, and it makes for a more fluid partnership with us as a federal department to help deliver.
I'd be very pleased to work with him.
Likewise, and I know will be an important node for keeping members of Congress informed too. I was very pleased during my last trip to the region to hear that the notice to proceed on construction for the Portal North Bridge has actually been issued. So looking forward to seeing direct movement there, and hope in short order for movement to begin on the next procedural steps to pave the way for the tunnels to get done as well. We're talking about such volume in terms of the passengers who count on these tunnels that you could live 1,000 miles away, somewhere in the Midwest, perhaps, like my old Indiana hometown, And you would feel the economic impact if something were to block the free passage of people through those tunnels. So we understand the urgency of this. Funding to include the Capital Investment Grant Program, which is transit oriented, but again, can benefit both transit and trains, as one example, is going to be very helpful in timely meeting these goals.
We're very much interested in being a partner here. Let us know. We'll be working with Mr. Calori as well. We're so glad that he's coming on board. We recognize that there's $100 million in the FY23, which is like the first funding for this. Just want to know what the next steps are because we don't want any delays. So, you know, steady as she goes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to first of all apologize for my colleague from California, Aguilar's comments earlier. He's got the memory of an elephant, so his defeat in the congressional baseball game still feels like it was yesterday. Very fresh. He's in the healing process. Hey, I wasn't going to weigh in on this EV conversation, but you said a few things that, frankly, I wish you were right, but the reality is I don't think you are, and I mean that very respectfully. I drive an electric car. I'm in California, so it's kind of the best and worst conditions. And I can tell you there really is not an ROI right now, even in California with the traffic, with the carpool lane options that we have. To charge a car at home through an outlet without the enhancements to your electrical system at home can take up to 4 days for, call it a 300-mile range. We shouldn't have to be subsidizing a product that costs anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000 per unit. That's not the federal government's role. The market space should be doing that. If you want to look at how do we help enable lower income families to acquire this technology, you should look at maybe downloading some of these incentives and rebates to the used car market on the resale side of things. The other problem we're seeing in California is that as more people buy electric vehicles, the demand on the electric grid becomes overwhelming. And as you know, in California, we also have this phenomenon with power shutoff options where the winds get above a certain speed, they turn our power off. So as an EV car owner, I sometimes go out to my car thinking I charged it, but that charging was stopped or interrupted because of the infrastructure challenges we have on our electrical grid due to high winds. So this isn't a utopian scenario yet. I want what you said to be true, but I think we've got a long ways to go still. And this is why I think our side is still encouraging the market space to consider other options while the OEMs evolve and while this becomes when we get to economic order of quantities and economies of scale, that may take a decade or so. And the efficiencies in the motors and the batteries will get there eventually, but we should not force that artificially at the expense of middle-class America. Just my commentary on that. My question is around high-speed rail, though. We talked about this last year when you came to us. In California, we've got this what I call Franken rail. It's this rail system that really doesn't know what it is. It's meandering through all the towns and villages and scaring the hell out of the locals. It's not high speed, it's not cheap, it's not effective, it's not efficient, it's not low emission. There's no ROI for this. There's no market space or demand in the cities that it's going to. Now over $105 billion. And last year when we talked about this, I kind of just requested that you look at this to make sure that we're not wasting federal subsidies and grants on this project. This isn't a political thing. This is a project that should have died a few years ago, and it's being propped up with a lot of taxpayer money now. I would rather invest in Metrolink. I would rather spend money on Amtrak. I would rather support projects like what Mr. Aguilar was talking about in the Redlands. This high-speed rail comes at such a cost that we're cannibalizing these meaningful rail projects. And so I would just implore you to look at this. It is eligible. It's not explicitly prohibited under these federal grant programs. But we have so many more options. If we want to invest $1 billion, $5 billion, $10 billion in rail in California, we have so many more options that will actually decompress our traffic patterns and get cars off the freeways and help commuters in a meaningful way. As we follow on to the execution conversation from last time, I would just ask that you continue to look at this The jobs can be had without flushing American federal taxpayer money down on this Franken Rail project. And we need to do the right thing on this one. I wanted to get your thoughts on that and any updates that you have from your perspective for California's high-speed rail.
Sure. What I'll say is that, we continue to want that project as we want any project to succeed. But I would emphasize the portfolio of investments that we have here that doesn't concentrate all of our hopes around high-speed rail or any rail in a single geography or a single project. Because, high-speed rail is so new in the U.S. That we haven't yet seen at scale what we might call the winning technology or project delivery mechanism. Although we're hopeful that through this infrastructure law, we can establish in at least 2 or 3 geographies, not a full national network, but 2 or 3 geographies, something that will demonstrate that we can do it just as well as anybody else in the world here. On the EV piece, I certainly recognize that the ROI depends on how expensive your car is and how expensive your electricity market is. And it's different in California than it is where I come from. Although I think we'll find that in time, it is increasingly becoming one that is clear regardless. But with regard to the grid issues, I can tell you we're sinking our teeth into those. It's part of what the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is working on. It's part of why we're glad that the infrastructure law includes grid improvements. And, just like the raw materials issues, there's two ways to take it, right? We can't accept it as an excuse to do nothing, but we do accept it as a challenge that we need to work on.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Horace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, once again, want to go back to the issues that the community that I represent, Southern California, San Bernardino, and LA County, low-income, vulnerable communities lack affordable transit options, as I stated earlier, which create a barrier in reaching those good-paying jobs that they could potentially get. That is why I introduced the Fair Transportation Act, which was largely included in the fiscal year 22 omnibus. Based on my bill, I spearheaded an effort in the omnibus to include funding and language directing DOT to develop metrics for measuring the effectiveness of surface transportation projects in addressing transportation challenges and barriers faced by historically disadvantaged communities, areas of persistent poverty, and public transportation dependent populations. Mr. Secretary, can you speak to the steps DOT has taken to equitably distribute transportation funding and investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law to distressed regions, low-income communities, areas of persistent poverty, and communities of color?
Thank you. Yes, we take this seriously as a moral as well as an economic imperative. Many people understand the concept of food deserts, neighborhood and areas where you can't access fresh, affordable, healthy food. The same is also true for transit. There are transit deserts or mobility deserts where it is difficult to be able to get to where you need to be. And if you were to access the American dream of getting education or work or both that will lift your economic circumstances, being cut off from transportation or mobility means being cut off from opportunity. That's why it's so important to make sure that these dollars are spent equitably. We've already considered this in discretionary grant programs like infra or RAISE. I was especially pleased to hear about at least one case where economically disadvantaged community of color had a vision for safety improvements and only decided to apply. They weren't going to apply, and then when they heard that we were taking these criteria seriously, they decided to, and it was such a deserving project that they wound up succeeding in getting funding. And so that's just one example of how in these discretionary programs, in ways that we're aiming to be very transparent about, we're making clear our commitments here. A good transportation system is one that works for everyone. And there are some areas, especially lower income areas, where people are disproportionately likely to depend on transit, where people often are one unreliable cousin with an unreliable car away from missing a shift at work and perhaps even losing their job. We've got to create better options for them. And it's something I think we have every opportunity to do through the funding that enhances our ability to support transit and support active transportation, which can also be part of the puzzle, just making it safer to be able to get around on foot, on bike, and through transit so that people can get to where they need to be.
Thank you for sharing that information with all of us. And thank you for your commitment to continue to support and highlight the needs of these communities that deserve to have their fair share. You know, on the issue of high-speed rail in California, I know that I don't have to educate you on this issue because you're very knowledgeable on what happened. The ballot initiative, Republicans insisted on that project starting in Central Valley because they demanded to have the jobs there. So, you know, starting a project there in Central Valley was what they wanted. The demise of high-speed rail in California is not the lack of demand or the lack of interest from our population. The demise is the constant lawsuits, the gumming up the processes that they have been able to not only increase the price, but delay a project that is desperately needed in California. I also want to go back to a question that was asked earlier regarding the electric vehicle working group. Thank you for creating that process. I just met last week with IBEW, and they're very, very concerned about, you know, the lack of training that some of the mechanics, folks that are working on these stationary recharging stations may have. So we really need to pay attention, you know, to that. Thank you again for being here with us today.
Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for sticking with us. You mentioned in our last conversation the race against time. I think we do agree on that. We do have a time crunch here, and it's clear that the administration does recognize the immediate value that the Iowa biofuels community has in this conversation, given the recent announcement, of course, to provide a waiver for the sale of E15 as a year-round fuel. And I know I've talked with many of these producers and processors. Iowa is absolutely ready to go to provide an affordable, environmentally friendly solution right now to help address fuel shortage concerns. And I know when we had a chance to talk personally last year, you talked about the importance of supporting our biofuels supporters and producers, which I certainly appreciate. So if you could talk a little bit today about the role that you see the DOT having in helping to support the increased use of biofuels to help meet carbon reduction goals long-term.
Well, thank you for the question. And we absolutely view biodiesels and biomass as a very important part of how we get to where we need to be on this urgent path toward reducing our emissions. It's something that hits close to home for me. When I was a mayor, our biggest water customer for our municipal utility was our ethanol plant. I've seen what that can do to create jobs and to be part of an all of the above energy strategy. I think a lot of the opportunity in the medium term for biofuels will be in some of the sectors that are hardest to decarbonize in transportation. And here I would point not only to the use that is certainly going to continue well through this decade in places like cars and trucks, but also aviation and the maritime sector. We stood up a sustainable aviation fuels grand challenge as part of the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy to find ways to reduce the cost and expand the production and use of sustainable aviation fuel or SAF. And so a lot of opportunity. Also further policies like blenders tax credits that might help get these things these technologies to scale. But also I would point to the maritime sector, one that on one hand, pound for pound is one of the least carbon intensive to move a ton of goods. On the other hand, just because of the sort of fuel that is burned there is contributing a disproportionate amount of carbon and other pollution and could benefit potentially from the widespread use of cleaner biofuels. Also, our Federal Rail Administration has previously partnered with Amtrak to look into biodiesel fuel for locomotives. And so there is some interesting opportunity there to consider as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I appreciate your commitment there to look at that all of the above energy strategy, because truly that is what consumers need right now. In Decorah, Iowa, I was there doing a town hall last week, and gas hit over $4 a gallon, diesel hit $5.30 a gallon. So this is something people are looking for, and E15 year round across the country could provide relief right now. So you actually hit on something else with the maritime industry, and I wanted to just flag the maritime program led by, of course, MARAD and the National Park Service to help preserve sites and artifacts from maritime history. I wanted to flag specifically about the USS the Sullivans is in dire need of repair right now. It's sinking at its station in Buffalo, named in honor of 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. They died when their ship was torpedoed in World War II. And right now it gets its money by generating revenue selling old vessels, but not enough money in the program right now to save all important items from our country's maritime history. So I would ask you today to commit to helping protect this legacy, work with my office on the National Heritage Maritime Program to ensure that ships like the USS the Sullivans get the necessary restorations that they need.
Well, thank you. Welcome chance to stay in touch with your office about the opportunity here. As I understand it, the National Maritime Heritage Grant Program is overseen by the National Park Service, but our Maritime Administration is at the table because some of the funding comes from our Vessel Operations Revolving Fund. And so would look forward to learning more and working with you on this.
And we need to have a good seat at the table there. So I appreciate anything you can do. And then lastly, you mentioned sustainable aviation fuel, and obviously that's reflected in the budget. A lot of communication from the EPA lately about the use of canola oil as well as other non-ag products in sustainable aviation fuels. But could you clarify a little bit today whether the investment in SAF will be using agricultural sources also?
So I think there's certainly that potential. I don't know all of the chemistry or science. My understanding is there's a great deal of interest and excitement about how those sources could be part of the answer for sustainable aviation fuels.
Yeah, well, I know I've met a lot with our biofuels guys. They are ready to go and want to have a seat at that table too. So thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the second opportunity, Mr. Secretary. I wanted to pick up on where my colleague, Congresswoman Torres, left off with respect to equity. One of the programs that we have been tracking in the bipartisan infrastructure law is the Transportation Workforce Outreach Program that will increase diversity and encourage young professionals to consider careers in the transportation sector. Can you talk a little bit about how investing in the Transportation Workforce Outreach Program will assist in improving transportation equity?
So I would point to 2 things. First, from an equity perspective, we know that there are some Americans and groups of Americans who just haven't historically been included in the transportation jobs or the construction jobs associated with maintaining, building, and operating our transportation infrastructure. We have a chance to change that by with different parties who have a good track record of training or preparing people to succeed in that workforce. And recognize that that's one of the most important things we can do to see to it that the opportunity to create generational wealth. And by that, I don't mean necessarily the wealthy, but just ordinary families being able to build up the wealth that goes into owning a home and being able to pass on through generations through these good paying jobs. The other thing I would point to is that this is not only important in terms of being the right thing to do, but frankly, important in terms of being able to successfully deliver. If you look at what this infrastructure law really calls for, what it's going to have to summon from us in terms of our business community, our productive capacity, our access to raw materials, and our workforce, we will not meet our goals unless we see to it that no talent is left on the table. And so this is an important part of being able to deliver and an important part of making sure that our delivery works for everybody.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. One last question on climate and resiliency. Obviously, we've talked about climate-related disasters and extreme weather and the need to improve resiliency in our transportation infrastructure. What steps does this budget proposal in front of us do, coupled with the bipartisan infrastructure law? How are we advancing more resilient investments in our transportation assets?
So a couple things that I would point to include the carbon reduction program. That's a formula program that the IIJA authorizes from the Highway Trust Fund an average of $1.3 billion per year. But that's going to be an important element of how we support the states in things that are going to reduce transportation emissions and extend multimodal options. A lot of different eligible projects are are conceivable here. And we just put out a couple of weeks ago and are looking forward to seeing what the states are going to be able to do with that. Then you have the resilience program called Protect. And we think that's especially important because we've seen the impact that these extreme weather events have on our transportation infrastructure right now. So if you look on one hand, measures like the EVs or support for transit that help reduce carbon emissions and help us avoid the worst climate change scenarios unfolding beginning in this decade. The Protect program recognizes that some of those effects are already upon us. And so planning grants, resilience improvement grants, evacuation route grants, grants for at-risk coastal infrastructure are going to be especially important, recognizing that if a 500-year flood is becoming an annual or biennial event, where infrastructure, such as road is getting washed out repeatedly, might not make sense to put it back the way it was originally placed over and over again. But that's pretty much all you could do with our traditional models of things like emergency relief funding through federal highway. So the Protect Formula program helps us get ahead of that. And we think that's going to be an important part of the story here. We'll have the formula guide for that new program out later on this summer, and it'll have a discretionary element alongside it so that we can support with things that we think we need to emphasize projects alongside what goes out by formula to the states.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Wexton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being so accommodating and sticking around. I think I'm the last questioner, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. Just have one more question for you. We talked some last year about GPS and the department's interagency work to provide resilient and alternative positioning, navigation and timing, or PNT services for critical infrastructure. And this has become even more urgent given the news that Russia's testing anti-satellite weapons that could endanger GPS satellites, and they've succeeded in jamming GPS signals in Ukraine and everything. So it is really important that we get this up and running. And as you're aware, in the FY22 Omnibus, we created a program which is housed at DOT and provided $15 million to help develop the needed requirements and standards and conduct additional testing. And I was just curious how that's going. How's it going?
So I can tell you that we're at work meeting those congressional requirements and working with that funding. As you know, one thing that changed since our last exchange is that the legislation kind of modified the act so that it's not selecting land-based as necessarily the technology, but it continues to move forward along principles that we support and consider very important, that are best summarized as protect, toughen, and augment, so that we have that kind of PNT resiliency. And we're going to continue working with the funding that's available to try to meet those expectations. Also working in coordination with interagency partners. We know that we have certain responsibilities that have been placed at our feet by Congress, but also can't do the kind of work, know how important DOD's role and Homeland Security's role will be.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for all that you're doing. Take care. And I will yield back, Mr. Chairman, with that.
Thank you, Mr. Tron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for sticking around and with us here. There's been a number of comments about Amtrak Joe over the course of the hearing and his 1 million+ miles on Amtrak. And I had the fortunate opportunity to be with the president last night at my home at an event that we had. And we talked about Amtrak, and he's certainly, very supportive of all you can do to continue to improve Amtrak in this Northeast corridor in particular. But we also talked about how we're literally hopelessly behind Europe, TTB, China, Japan on bullet trains, the high-speed rails, 300+ miles an hour, that we know the technology's there. And I want to get an update on a project that runs through Maryland. It's very important to everybody in the Maryland delegation, and that is on maglev. Maglev has potential to create almost 160,000 jobs. It's supported by labor, and it's a very environmentally friendly technology. Japan is willing to put in their IP of $6 billion. And they're willing to fund 50% of the first leg, the test between Washington and Baltimore, which will make that commute, which is congested now, environmentally very unfriendly, 15 minutes. So we wanted to get an update if I could. There's been 4 appropriations in the last 4 cycles that moved into the Federal Railway Administration. And what's the status on those dollars in the Federal Railway Administration from the last 4 appropriations on getting those released so the project can do its EIS and EIS work and regulatory process? And how do we get those funds released?
So I'll give you a high-level overview based on what I know, and then would be happy to provide one in more detail through the FRA. What I know is that there was, as you said, a sequence of grants to the Maryland DOT on this. The first the second did not, and I think they require certain deliverables that would need to be ready in terms of the statement of work, financial information about the proposed budget schedule, everything that goes with that. I know that there was preliminary engineering and design that was to be supported through FRA funds that went to the Maryland Department. And that this is subject to, I think, an agreement that dates back to fiscal 16 to try to advance the environmental review there. But following the public comment period, that was paused or get more information about costs and other things would be necessary for project success. So having shared that much that I could right now, let me get with our team and try to get you a more up-to-the-minute update on the state of it.
And who, Mr. Secretary, would be a good point person for us to follow up with?
So ultimately, this comes to the FRA and addressing the FRA administrator, Amit Bose, of course, with copy to my office would be probably the best way to address a query.
Okay, that's fantastic. We make transformative investments in our rail and just continuing to be so far behind the rest of the world is not who we are. So thank you so much for your attention to this, and we'll follow up. I yield back.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do believe that concludes our second round, unless there's a member who hasn't been heard. I think we've accommodated everyone. And Ms. Secretary, thank you for participating in this hearing and sticking with us, as many have said. We look forward to working with you as we craft the fiscal 2023 appropriations bill. The committee staff will be in contact with your budget office regarding questions for the record. We will have, I'm sure, a number of questions for the record, and we will submit them and would appreciate as quick a response as you could manage. If you could work with OMB to return the information to the committee within 30 days from Friday, we'll be able to publish the transcript of today's hearing, and that'll help us make informed decisions for 2023. Mr. Diaz-Balart, you have any final comments?
Mr. Chairman, no, thank you very much on I thought, a very, very good meeting, and thank the Secretary for spending this time.